So now I'll actually introduce Robyn and David, if you come up. So Robyn and David both work for GHD, and you'll be all familiar with their sort of global engineering and professional services company, working on a range of infrastructure projects in many, many sectors. Earlier this year, both Robyn and David worked on the team that reviewed the performance of Brisbane City Council in their response to the flooding events. And recent projects for them both have included work in disaster planning management, response and transition to recovery. So if you all put your hands together for Robyn and David. Cool.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to be here. I'd like to acknowledge the welcome from Councillor Gowdy. I'd like to also acknowledge John Hamilton, Clive Manley, Janice Miller and her organising team. We were delighted to be invited to join you at your conference. We're going to talk, as Councillor Gowdy mentioned, on the Brisbane floods. As you probably gathered, I'm the Kiwi and David is the Australian, and we combine for this effort. I'll set the scene by giving you a little bit of background on GHD and what we brought into this review. We've then got a short video to really take you back to January and some of the images that we saw on our television screens. David will provide you with a background of the flood, and then I will go into the approach we took to the review of Brisbane City Council, some of the lessons learnt, and we really welcome your questions and discussion because this is part of obviously growing and sharing. So who are we? GHD is a global company. There's about 6,500 of us working for GHD. We're located across 5 continents. We've got a very long history with New Zealand. GHD started in 1928 by 2 Australians and a New Zealander. So I guess we can all be proud of a long history of this firm. Where are we in the North Island? I know most people here are from the North Island. We've actually got 12 offices in the North Island, and more recently we've just opened a small office in the Hawke's Bay. So we've got people on the ground and all of your communities are very easily able to be there. GHD has 5 global sectors of business: transportation, water and properties and building are our large ones, and then energy and resources and environment. So why am I telling you this? One of the real benefits and what we were able to bring to Brisbane City Council, although I won't be covering it today, was we also were able to bring advice on planning, building codes and engineering solutions, which was all part of this review. Now, the review was being done with the backdrop of a Royal Commission, so it was obviously vitally of interest to the Flood Review Board, which we'll cover shortly, and the Council, that it was a very robust review. Just touching on the numbers briefly, we're about a $1 billion Australian a year company, just to give you a feel for our scale. So I'm now going to try the technology and move out of this one and move on to the video.
As we weep for what we have lost, and as we grieve for family and friends, I want us to remember who we are. We are Queenslanders. We're the people that they breed tough north of the border.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
You can hear the terror in their voices.
Oh my God!
The uncertainty. The flash flood had begun in Toowoomba and raced down the range. Before striking Grantham, it hit Murphy's Creek. 1 minute the waterway was a stream, the next an unstoppable torrent.
Is this scary or what?
cyclone is like nothing that we have ever dealt with before as a nation. The people of North Queensland tonight are bearing the brunt of it. It doesn't take much for any of us to imagine what they might be going through. But we all need to recognise that we will all have to brace for this. We remembered what it is to be a Queenslander. The ones who today, in every town and city, in every street and suburb, in every farm and business, in every nook and cranny, are proving that when we get knocked down, we get right back up again.
Why can't I find mine? Rescue.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me over here today, and I thank you, Councillor Gowdy, in particular. He mentioned everyone sitting up at the back of the room. My grandfather was a fire and brimstone congregational preacher, and he said all the good Christians sit at the back of the church. So welcome to everyone, especially those guys in the back row. The other thing I can't help but mention, because I am a Queenslander and a keen rugby player, is congratulations on the World Cup. It was a magnificent win, and I do trust you that you'll realise that our young team is tasting the bitter taste of defeat at the moment, and we're looking forward to 4 years of complacency by the All Blacks, and we're looking forward to the next World Cup soon. But it was a great tournament. I had the pleasure of being over here in Auckland for that dreadful Ireland-Australia match, and also in Wellington for the quarterfinals, and you guys really deserve to take your hats off. You put on a great show. Look, today I just thought I'd give you a bit of an overview about Brisbane City and the response to the flood. Robyn will talk specifically about our review, but be really pleased to sort of get into a discussion and answer some questions for you after that. But going back a step, Brisbane City Council, like many jurisdictions, has a lot of risks we need to prepare for. And in terms of the profiles, they come in that order, really. It's summer storms, which happen around this time of year, late October, November. We've, of course, got floods, storm surges that come with the cyclones. Cyclones do cross the coast as far down as Port Stephens, which is in the middle of New South Wales. Brisbane and the Gold Coast have had cyclones in the past. Oil and chemical spills. We had a major oil spill just about 18 months ago that resulted in quite a severe lot of damage to Moreton Bay. And of course, we can't forget terrorism is still a real risk within Australia. So the preparation that Brisbane City Council had took into account those hierarchy of risks. Just to sort of go back a step again, that's a great little graph that was actually on the front of the Major General's review of Brisbane City Council's response to the flood. And I guess what I'd point out is that if you go back to sort of last century, or the century before last, it was pretty wet. And there was a series of major flooding events in Greater Brisbane over 100 years. Really, from the period of just after the war through till 2011, we've only had minor incidents. So people got used to the sort of fact that we hadn't had a major flooding event, which I'll talk to you about soon. But it's just worth realising that if we did go back to some milder weather patterns, it would be a completely different story in Brisbane and Australia. As the presentations alluded to, you know, we had a record period of drought. For 10 years before the floods, we were sort of down to about, you know, less than 20% dam capacity. We were building desalination plants. We were looking at drinking purified recycled water, which is basically your wee. We were looking at all those sorts of options because we were running out of water. But really things changed. We had a good year of rain in 2010, and particularly around this time of year. The catchment was saturated. Most of Queensland was saturated. And as the video said, at one point, more than half of all local governments were significantly infected. They were declared disaster zones, and an area larger than France and Germany combined was underwater. But back in southeast Queensland, everything was relatively good at that point. But again, the catchments were saturated. We all came back from holidays in the second week of January, and we started to get a fair bit of rain. Those are some figures for you. I won't go into that with detail, but just, you know, between the 7th and 12th of January we had significant rainfalls, but in particular in the Wivenhoe catchment that had been very dry for the last 10 years, we had some incredibly strong rainfall that fed straight into the catchment. SEQ Water, that runs the show in terms of water management in South East Queensland, actually have determined that the river volumes were similar to the 1893 flood, which was that really big line you saw before. And as you saw, some of the stats there, we had 15,000 properties, 4,000 roads and streets, 30 bikeways, 260 parks severely affected. We had half the city's ferry terminals were completely destroyed. And there were 250,000 tonnes of waste generated. So the logistics and the size and the scale of the disaster were beyond what anyone ever imagined. That brings us to the review of the flood, and I'll hand it over to Robyn now, and then I'll participate in the discussion later on. But going back a step, I can't stress the fact that we did have 10 years of severe drought before this event. We also had a changed population. I was at work in the first week of January, and I'm a Queenslander. I'm sixth-generation Queenslander. I can remember talking to my great-grandmother about, you know, her memories of the 1893 flood and those sorts of things. So for me, I was attuned to what was going on. But in the group of people that I sat around with, there were no people that had lived there for more than 5 years. And so a couple of myths developed. The big myth, of course, in southeast Queensland was the Wivenhoe Dam. I can remember going to buy a house in a flood zone several years ago, and the real estate agent said, "Don't worry about it, Wivenhoe will fix that. It's never going to flood again." So we had built up a fair bit of complacency. We didn't have a lot of local knowledge within the community, so a lot of the residents had just moved to Brisbane, so they didn't know what was happening. And therefore it was a great challenge for the authorities when they were responding to this disaster. And as we'll see, you know, Brisbane City Council was prepared, and a key to that preparation was leadership at the top, but the performance of the people on the ground. And with that, I'll hand to Robyn now.
Thanks, David. The Brisbane City Council appointed an independent flood review board. The flood review board was led by Major General Peter Arneson, supported by a QC and a very well-respected engineer. The Flood Review Board was the board that we actually worked with and reported to. The council was very particular. They wanted an arm's length relationship with this review. Our review then formed part of the Flood Review Board's report through to the council in May, to then obviously the council had a submission to the Royal Commission, because the Royal Commission was sitting throughout the last few months, and David will actually provide us with a little bit of an update on the work of the Royal Commission later on in the presentation. We looked at our review in terms of readiness, response and transition to recovery. Now, the timeframes we worked to in terms of readiness was up till the 11th of January. The response phase was the 12th to the 14th of January, and then the transition to recovery was the 15th to the 22nd of January. We were commissioned on the 21st of January and we started work on the 23rd of January. That was absolutely brilliant because it meant we were actually part of all the debriefs. So we were able to immerse ourselves and really hear firsthand, and it was fresh in everyone's memory. It wasn't months later when people were thinking, what did we do, what was good and what did we learn. So that was, you know, very, very good position to be in for us to do this review. In Australia, there are, I'm sure you're quite aware, there are federal and state policies that local government has to comply with. In terms of getting a baseline, we actually had to look at all of the legislation, the policies, and then within the council, the disaster management plan, sitting off the disaster management plan, the concepts of operations, and all the business continuity planning, and any other documentation that actually related to the work of Brisbane City Council in its response to disaster or emergency management. We used that as our baseline to conduct a desktop review because we didn't know when we walked in what we would be dealing with. We were a third party coming in to actually do this review. Were we going to actually find significant gaps, or really was this going to be a continuous improvement? And so the way we structured our review was that we would be doing the desktop review and then providing an interim report through to the Flood Review Board with key themes and recommendations for the next phase of work. What we found was the Brisbane City Council did brilliantly, and the approach we recommended was a continuous improvement approach. At that stage, we also identified all the internal and external stakeholders we would like to interview. We designed an interview procedure, which we then identified from the Lord Mayor, councillors, senior council officers, heads of external agencies. As well, we undertook a citizens study of citizens, a small sample of residents and business owners to get their views on how they thought the council performed, because we really did want that 360-degree review to be included in this piece of work we were doing. And then we completed our final report. We had 6 weeks to do that in, so we were going pretty fast when you put in 71 interviews, plus your community interviews, and all the desktop work we needed to do. As I mentioned, the council did superbly, and it was, for us, a continuous improvement review. Why did they do superbly? So after every significant event, they'd had an independent review. They had implemented the recommendations, and they really focused on improvement at every time. They looked to how can we do something differently, do it better. In terms of key strengths in the readiness phase, their policies and plans were really robust. Their business continuity planning, with a few exceptions, was very, very good quality and good standard, and it had regular reviews and regular testing. They had the structures in place in terms of their disaster management plan, and this went right through from what happened within their governance structure. The governance structure is in 2 parts. There's a local disaster management group. Now, that is led by the Lord Mayor. That sets the strategic direction and has the interface with the Deputy Premier on it, senior external agencies, members of that particular committee, as well as the Chief Executive of the Council and some senior officers. They then provide the delegation down into the local disaster coordination centre. Pretty much, we've got different models now running in New Zealand with the Auckland model and now the Wellington model versus the regional councils and with the local councils relationship. But there's a lot of similarities between the Australian set-up and the New Zealand set-up. In the local disaster coordination centre, they actually have 4 teams, slightly different names to what we would call them. They're a forward planning team, which makes pretty much sense with what they're focused on, and they generally are running about 7 people every shift. The field operations group would be running 9 to 10 people every shift, without in the field response teams actually implementing instructions that were going out. Brisbane City had divided themselves into 4 sectors so that they had teams in each sector. Again, this was one of the learnings from past events. A intelligence team focused on sourcing and verifying intelligence, and then an incident support team providing administration, logistics, and interestingly enough, a little bit different, I think, to a lot of us in New Zealand, the communications actually sits over there within their incident support team. The leadership and direction, which David touched on, was superb in terms of getting the community ready. The Lord Mayor had a huge number of messages going out as the storm season approached. It was predicted it was going to be a pretty nasty storm season last year. I guess Australia's a bit lucky, aren't they? They kind of know about October you've got to get ready for the storm season. We don't have that luck on our side when we have earthquakes and oil groundings of ships in terms of knowing to get ready, because over there they have a very clear season. They had a big rain event last October, which meant they stood up their local disaster coordination centre, so they had a complete run-through of running through an actual real live emergency. And then in November and December, as is their habit, they ran a lot of training and scenario training. So in terms of getting ready, they couldn't have done more to get their people ready and prepared for what turned into a very, very busy January and February. What could be improved in terms of getting ready was the flood map information. Very useful if you're an engineer or a hydrologist, but absolutely hopeless if you're a citizen wondering what's going to happen. Is my house going to get flooded? When do I need to move things to the second story, or when do I need to leave? So there's definitely improvements there which were recognised. Although the business continuity planning of the Central Business District is not an accountability of the Brisbane City Council, it was certainly evident that a number of businesses probably had gaps or non-existent plans. Along with it, a lot of the basements got flooded, and most of the high-rise buildings, the lift, the motors and all the electricity boards and everything were in the basement, so they were all flooded. So that meant a number of buildings took a while to get up and running, and of course that means your local economy suffers if businesses are not functioning. As you heard with the big rains and the water, the 12th of January was really when everything really had to be stood up to full activation. So on the 12th of January, the Local Disaster Coordination Centre was stood up to full activation, which is at level 4. There are 4 levels of activation within the Brisbane structure. Levels 1 and 2 are watching with the staff that are actually within the centre, keeping a watch on events. Level 3, your Local Disaster Coordination Centre is stood up. Level 4, the Local Disaster Management Group with the Lord Mayor and the Deputy Premier and senior people from the agencies were all, from the 12th of January, obviously fully functioning. Brisbane really met its requirements with really a few gaps and a few small tweaks needed, but overall they performed very, very well. So in the response, it's always a good test, isn't it? We can have all the plans and all the policies and documents and how we're going to do things, but really when it really, really happens and you actually have to use them, it's really a good test. Is it going to be, are they going to work? Is everybody going to know what they're doing? Everything worked really well. They were really, in terms of their policies and plans, there was a little bit of tweaking needed in their concept of operations in some areas, but overall that was very credible and robust. The Local Disaster Management Group, led by the Lord Mayor, provided superb communication out into the community, as well as delegation into the organisation. The culture of Brisbane City Council was such that the people really were empowered to get on and sort it. And that was really evident to us when we did our review and did our interviews, and no doubt contributed to their success of managing through this disaster. The staff, many of them had to step up, because outside of the Local Disaster Coordination Centre with the staff that had been trained, there were some other drivers that meant that they needed to bring in other people to help. One being, as you could see in the video clip, it wasn't just about Brisbane City, it was actually about the whole state. So, you know, even your worst case scenario planning, if you have a whole state out, you can imagine the services that were supporting Brisbane City Council, such as Red Cross, were really stretched in terms of their resources. So that meant that management within Brisbane City Council who ordinarily may not have got as involved were required to come in and step up. And in 2 areas in particular, one was in the evacuation centres, and I'll talk a little bit more a little later about some of the learnings. And the other was with volunteers, and I look at Christchurch and I look at the Bay of Plenty with volunteering. Within about 24 hours, Brisbane City Council had to decide how they were going to manage the volunteering numbers. There were 23,000 people registered as volunteers. So within 24 hours, they had to set about and develop a plan, how it was going to operate on the ground, how they were going to move people, where they were going to move people to, how they were going to identify the hazards, the safety briefings, ensure people were going to be safe. So that was a huge step up, and we met some interesting senior management who really took on that challenge and made it work. And obviously there's learnings from that, but it was people needing to step outside their comfort zone, and that was very evident to us, and full compliments to them and their ability to do that. The Local Disaster Coordination Centre worked well. We've got some recommendations there for them. They were fortunate that they'd actually invested in some refurbishment last year. So they had a centre that was better to work from, had more equipment, more space, so that the shifts of council staff as well as the external agencies were able to actually operate in there very effectively. Communications and public information, and Councillor Gowdy alluded to that, circumstances drove them to move into social media with speed. The biggest issue that arose for Brisbane City Council was the collapse of their website. The website, it was a bandwidth issue, and they didn't have a website, and consequently they didn't have any email for 24 hours. So you can imagine when you're right in the response phase and you've got a population screaming for information and you aren't able to get it out through your electronic means, it certainly drove innovation in the communications team. Most of them were working remotely from home, and they set about getting very busy with social media, using Facebook and using Twitter. And Twitter is a very active medium, and so that meant they needed to have staff monitoring the Twitter at all times, because as we all know, it can also have a lot of misinformation on it, to make sure that any information that was incorrect was corrected. It's interesting, there was an external specialist company in Queensland that wasn't anything to do with our review, but they undertook a review of the use of social media during the January floods. And Queensland Police and Brisbane City Council, both organisations really embraced social media and were both given good marks for the way that they handled it. And I think when we see what's happening really with the use of social media in all of our business environments, it's certainly going to drive the way we work. The downside to all of that is you actually need power. And if you're flooded and you haven't got any electricity and your batteries run down on your mobile devices, that became an issue for some people. And so the council had to resort back to its use of newsletters and posters, as well as radio and television. But interestingly, one thing that came to light with our work with the community group was people were inventive enough to realise if there's a shopping centre open, you go in there and have a jolly good look, you'll probably find the cleaners, electrical sockets, and you can plug your chargers in there. Maybe there's something in there about phone chargers, car chargers as well, but you know, if we're becoming so reliant on technology, we actually need something to make sure we can access it if there's no mains power supply. So just something to note there. But they certainly, you know, really fabulous performance from the communications staff. The business continuity planning, with one or two exceptions, stood up, and it really meant that the council was able to perform really well. It's a bit like Christchurch. It was a tale of two cities. Half the city was fine. There was nothing that impacted it, and the other half was flooded, and it was a huge impact. The council was able to, during this time, keep its services going, business as usual services, to the unimpacted areas, and actually as well as focus on the response to the flooded areas. So it was very well managed. Areas for improvement, I have touched on the website. After 24 hours, they were able to get a static website up and get an offshore third party to actually run another website. But in terms of reputation, and I know everyone sitting in this room will be worried about the reputation of their organisation, that's a pretty public thing to have go wrong, not having a website. I mentioned the Local Disaster Coordination Centre and the refurbishment, and it really worked well, but there was some refinements that we recommended. I guess most of us have experienced people writing books when they're writing sit reps. There was a little bit of refinement needed in the sit rep process with some people. Also, there was some work needed around the shift changeovers, the handover briefings. Some of the teams were a bit light. The forward planning team was a bit light in numbers. They were only running 7 on a shift, and so we recommended they probably needed some more people. They needed to divide their team in two. So they had a team that was focused on the next 72 hours, and then a team that focused beyond the 72 hours, and have a cell that was already set up, ready to come in to manage the volunteering, because the volunteering with the vast quantity of numbers needing to manage that certainly put some pressure on the local disaster coordination centre. There was some opportunity also to look at some of the standard operating procedures just to refine those, but again, continuous improvement. The flood map information was problematic because with so many people impacted with their homes potentially going to flood, or when will we be flooded, when do we have to leave, it was really not useful, and I'm sure there's a lot of work going on there. In fact, Brisbane City Council has published a whole document on there, what they're doing to respond to the recommendations, so they're very proactive and a lot of things have already been done. Workforce planning became an issue in terms of fatigue. I did mention the great numbers of needing to cope with the volunteers. Some of the, during the response phase, was some very long hours put in. Again, the recommendation around needing a few more people on some of the shifts. Also, one of the things that they did well was they actually mentored and trained people into roles at the same time as going through the response phase. But there's definitely some opportunity in there for looking across at their workforce, looking at how they can have more people trained and ready to step in if a disaster was going to go longer, but also ensuring that they capped the number of hours people were on shift. Alluded to the evacuation centres and the issue with the resources being stretched right across the state. I suspect there's quite a few rugby or league players here. One of the evacuation centres that was on the plan was Suncorp Stadium. Well, Suncorp was well underwater, so that wasn't going to be any use at all. They settled on two other locations that had been identified as evacuation centres. And there was quite a lot of learning from that. Again, this was senior council staff that had to step in and help when external agencies didn't have enough resource. The largest centre had 2,400 people at one time in it. It did raise some issues in terms of the layout of the centre, in terms of the ablution blocks and the relationship of the ablution blocks to where the general groups of people were. There were issues around the registration and deregistration of people coming and going and needing to have some more technology in there to help support that, because certainly when you've got a rush of people, you need to be able to deal with them and very quickly. There were issues that came about with some of the social groups that were in there, some cultural and religious areas that needed to be taken account of, and also the need to really be organised with procurement. It was lucky the local supermarkets were very obliging, because councils generally don't have baby nappies and baby food and toothbrushes and toothpaste on their procurement lists. So again, getting that prepared so that you really have a button to push when you need it. I mentioned the communications and public information and the website failure, but I guess out of everything that's bad, if something good happens, and the way that they embrace social media and the way the impact of it, and certainly one of the things that did highlight for the manager in this area was the sorts of skills that he may have to be looking for in his communications department, moving away from the older, more traditional channels into new channels. And so what does that mean? Certainly means you need people around 24 hours a day if you're going to be running Twitter, because you need to be able, while you're asleep, because an awful lot of damage can happen to your organisation if you haven't got someone monitoring it. So interesting new world that we're embracing with social media. In the transition to recovery, the clean-up to get back to business as usual was amazing. I flew into into Brisbane on the 22nd of January, and by then clean-up was in full force. They had a weekend of busy cleaning up, and the few days towards the end of that week, people were embracing it. The estimate was there was 50,000 people out with their buckets and spades and brooms, in addition to the 23,000 that formally were registered and that went through the process of being bussed into locations to do the clean out. So the scale of people out cleaning up was phenomenal. That linked in with the relationships. The Australian Army had a significant role in Brisbane City Council's clean-up procedures, along with their contractors. The contractors supplied trucks and heavy machinery. Church groups came in and cleaned up, and then there was obviously all the individuals as well. So when we looked at their transition to recovery, one of the areas we looked at were the concept of operations and how that was structured. And one of the structures that they had in place was to get council subcommittees up and running really quickly and those had membership and agendas all predetermined. So that meant that committees were already meeting on planning, on water, on finance, on the economy. So they had a focus immediately as part of the recovery to have those committees focused on what were the learnings and where should the council be focused. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we came in with work in the planning area, with engineering solutions as well as building codes, because this was a very wide, broad issue for the council to be dealing with. Waste removal, David mentioned the volume of waste. They had every skip in Brisbane deployed. The first area of risk was actually food waste, rotting food. So to get that out of streets, they had skips for collecting that, as well as skips for household goods like furniture and electrical goods, etc. The issue that came up was finding the right dump sites, because if you're going to have trucks on hard stand areas, you actually need to have them engineering designed so they're not going to destroy them. So they were able to identify 65 sites across the flooded area as dump sites, and so materials were taken there and left there and then taken from there out to a dump. So there was sort of 65 places that there was big piles of rubbish. And certainly it took a while for that to be cleared, but it was one way of having an orderly way of cleaning up and getting those homes and streets tidy very quickly. The business volunteers were really, really positive. It was particularly noted that they were well trained. So if it was a contractors team or a team that works in some way in the community, that's used to handling machinery, used to working out in the field, in terms of volunteers, they were a brilliant group because they could be deployed with very little briefing and they would actually get on and get the job done. Other volunteers did a superb job with their buckets and brooms, but of course there's more risk in terms of health and safety and hazard identification with people that are very keen but perhaps aren't trained to think about what might be the risks. Areas for improvement, I have touched on the coordination of the volunteers, and our recommendation was that they developed up a concept of operations for the Local Disaster Coordination Centre, which really had a cell that could be called up and stood up should volunteers be going to be part of a particular event, because that would have it in a very ordered, organised way for them. Traffic management, you can imagine 50,000 people out there driving, along with the buses taking the volunteers that had registered with the council, along with other people, and also the trucks that were part of the clean-up. Traffic snarl-ups were pretty typical and quite a concern, so there's definitely work to do to think about how traffic management would play out in any future event. There were also concerns at night, because a lot of the street lighting, and there were no traffic signals, and there were a lot of trucks moving around at night, and there was concern highlighted in our review that needed to be considered in future as well, so that maybe there could be some temporary traffic signals brought in, particularly. I've talked a bit already about the evacuation centres, but part of it was circumstance with the agencies being so stretched across the state, but also an opportunity to look at the locations, because a number of people couldn't actually access the evacuation centres because the river cut them off. So it's actually looking across the city and making sure that the plans included evacuation centres that would take account of any flood event. Just a few snapshots of the spirit of Brisbane, and it was a very alive and well. I had the privilege while I was over there to go to a meeting with the infrastructure group and another one with the property professional group in Brisbane, and I was really overwhelmed at the attitude of these people just so quickly after the floods. What can we do to make our city better? They were really focused on that, and I think the spirit of Brisbane, I can see why they often beat us in sport, because it certainly was evident in the clean-up that I saw going on. So what were the critical success factors as we saw them? The council over many years had laid down very good foundations for its disaster emergency management arrangements. They'd always had, after every significant event, a third-party review, immediately put in place any recommendations, continued to grow and evolve. Business continuity planning and business continuity testing was built into their culture. They didn't leave anything to chance. They invested in their people in terms of training and development and making sure that everyone that had an opportunity for that training. They looked at their policies and plans. You know, we've all lived with policies and plans, but they actually tested them, made sure that they were living documents, and we were able to very clearly find that in our review. Their management arrangements, particularly the culture in the organisation, the empowerment from the senior staff down through the organisation, really drove the organisation to perform superbly. Their relationships with external agencies was very evident. They have a very strong relationship with the Australian Army, very strong relationship across the various state agencies, the state government, Red Cross, and a whole raft of different agencies that all come together to work their way through any event, whether it be a training scenario or whether it be a live event. As I mentioned earlier, they're very fortunate they have a storm season, so that they did have all their planning around their storm season in terms of getting ready, but also the communications. The Lord Mayor had a very strong campaign, but interestingly, pre-flood, it was estimated, because there is an early warning alert system, an SMS system over there, that the residents of Brisbane City could actually register for. Only 1 in 10 households was actually registered for that. So, you know, I think we've all struggled over the years, haven't we, to get people to focus on being prepared, get yourself organised, and I don't think it was really any different in Brisbane to what we would have found maybe in New Zealand. Now things have changed in the last 12 months. The council had made a good investment in terms of their local disaster coordination centre, the refurbishment there, so they had the equipment that they needed to actually carry out the role. The communications campaigns, internally as well as externally, obviously supported and drove the good performance of the council and the empowerment and really the culture of the organisation and the strong relationships. So before I go into things to watch, because this is more of a general slide, summarising the performance of Brisbane City Council, it was very good to superb. And many of the recommendations have already been implemented, and obviously this is the way that they work in Brisbane City Council, so we were delighted to have been commissioned to do that work. Just in terms of things to watch in a more general sense, and I'm sure many of you looking around the room are probably very aware of it, because I think most of you have probably been deployed in Christchurch or Bay of Plenty this year. The post-event trauma, and I'm sure health and safety and HR professionals are really watching you and all your staff to see that everyone keeps well. There's always a risk, particularly with us, or most of us working in political organisations, of over-planning after an event. You know, the one thing that went wrong becomes the big focus, rather than the 99% of the things that went well. So all the efforts go on to the one thing that went wrong, and you actually let the foot off the rest of it, and so something else will pop up next time. So it's just getting the balance, really, and continuing to identify and manage risk over time. You really just got to keep your eye on everything, making sure that your business continuity planning is robust and it's tested, and it really works. You know, just ticking the box. There's been a lot of box ticking with business continuity planning over the years. People have got to think through, so what does it really mean? And always needing to be ready. And I suspect all of you are ready all the time for whatever might be coming. Just hand over to David, and you'll hear from me again. I'll
just wrap up just to give you a bit of an overview about the Royal Commission, and really our review was partly preparing the Brisbane City Council for that Royal Commission. So that's why our review was very quick, because the Royal Commission was going to look at this in a lot of detail. But firstly, are there any lawyers in the room at the moment? Because I'm going to bag them. Look, the Royal Commission has been meeting for 12 months now, and I guess at the moment there seems to be a lot of focus on process, and I guess it builds on what Robyn said just then about the over-planning. There's a lot of focus on dam manuals and the operators of the dams and planning schemes, and inevitably a bit of a blame game you're getting in the Royal Commission. The thing I would stress with everyone, and it's the same here, that, hey, Brisbane's built on a floodplain. There's no getting away from that. So these major events will happen again, and they could be worse. I talked about the 1893 flood. there were evidence of floods that have reached peaks of 12 metres, which is 3 times as big as the Brisbane flood. So that's the reality. It's going to happen, and we can have the best plans in place, but as we all know, nothing always goes to plan. So, you know, one of the lessons I've got is plan, but the best thing, as Robyn said, is to test, train and learn. The relationships on the ground were key, but they were developed through that scenario planning, that testing, that training. So by the time we got to the event, the guys were ready to go. They knew their counterparts and allied organisations, and the relationships were there. The leadership stuff I can't stress enough. The leadership was set from the top, so there was clear, simple directions coming out, clear, simple communication directions. But at the end of the day, they adapted at the local level, and the councillor said that before about being able to adapt. And that's what really made the difference in Brisbane, because there were dozens of differing events all around the city, and the local guys on the ground adapted, and importantly, the CEO of the council delegated authority and said basically, look, you blokes, you know, you're the guys that know how to do this best. The rule book's out the window, just get on with it, but just don't do anything illegal. That was the message to him, and things paid off. So the ability to adapt is key. The decentralised model, I think, is important as well. As I mentioned before, there's been a lot of focus with the Royal Commission about that. You need structures at a decentralised local level to pick up when some of the central planning worked. And again, the Facebook communications, the most visited and most effective site was the Queensland Police Service Facebook site. It was an incredible point of communication. So again, to wrap up with the Royal Commission, they're doing a great job, but it's really the people on the ground that need to adapt and to be well trained and to adapt to the various scenarios that made the key difference in Brisbane.
Thanks, David. And so what are we doing in terms of GHD? What are we contributing? So we're working across a range of areas, reviews like the one I've just described, natural hazard risk management, community resilience strategies, damage assessment and reporting, and strategic and operational business continuity reviews. So really right across the gamut of emergency management, disaster planning. And so who are we working with? We're working with a number of local governments across Australia, state government agencies, utilities and government-owned corporations, and increasingly companies in the private sector, particularly in the resources sector. So it's your turn now for some questions. And I noticed there was a number of people writing madly, so I assume there must be a question or two out there.
Yep. Yeah, the question there was about those, the flood maps, and they were very engineeringly based, and what's being put in place to replace that. Look, the information was there, and as Robyn said, if you were an engineer and you talked in QMEX and all that sort of thing, you had a fair idea. But the individuals, the households and the businesses wanted to know how it was going to affect their particular property at a particular point in time. There's a lot of work going on at the moment in terms of just using Google Maps, the images and the information that was gathered by the flood to enable a situation where you as a resident of a business will be able to click on various scenarios and see what the impact would that be. Not only the physical impact on your property, but when things like, where are the substations located? So you know that when it gets to this level, you're going to lose power. When it gets to this scenario, roads are going to be closed. Those sort of basic information in an integrated way. Now, we're not there yet. There was a hope that there'd be a system in place by this summer. We haven't got there, but there's a lot of work being done there. Yeah, the question was about the what was referred to as the hydro dams. It runs a bit of electricity when they let the water out the floodgates, but its primary purpose is not to generate electricity. There's been a lot of controversy, I guess, between the operating of the dam. There was a lot of, particularly with one of the major newspapers afterwards, which basically ran a big campaign saying that if the water was released in a more effective way, Brisbane wouldn't have flooded. That's been consequently proven to be a bit, to be wrong. But having said that, the dam manual has been reviewed. There was a few situations there where there's some overlapping areas of responsibility. The dam operators in Queensland are completely independent. They operate under a dam manual and cannot take any direction from anyone. And that resulted from 1974, because I can remember as a kid where the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, a guy called Clem Jones, who's quite famous in Brisbane, he was the Lord Mayor, but he also maintained the wicket at the Gabba as well as a sort of job for free. He wasn't really interested in the advice he was getting by the dam operators. And as the head of the local disaster management group in that area, he actually sent the police up to the dam at Somerset and directed them to open the gates. As a result of that, it's very strict and very stringent at the moment. I don't think the Royal Commission will move away from that, and I think people that actually out there would much rather have bureaucrats having control of those sorts of decisions than a politician, perhaps, who has to answer to different drivers than a bureaucrat. Yes. Yeah, do you want me to?
You can do that because you're local.
Yeah. There was a lot of confusion out there. The question was around the dam, and there were rumours that the dam was going to break. And we've all seen the dam busters on TV and seen what devastation that has. I won't give you an engineering lecture because I'm an economist, but there are things called fuse plugs in the dams, and they're basically designed that when the dam reaches a certain level, they release, and then the water is released from there. But once those fuse plugs go, you have no control in terms of releasing the dams. Yes, there was a lot of rumours saying the dam was going to break, but that's where your Facebook police media site was really critical. Your Twitter, the social media sites were very critical, and also the Lord Mayor and the Premier as well. I can't understate what a key role both the Premier and the Lord Mayor played in giving simple, clear directions. And they were very, very helpful in reassuring people that it wasn't going to break, because there was some panic there. Because at one stage I can remember talking to our water guys who did some sums, it was about on the Tuesday, and said, hang on, something going wrong here. There's a lot more water going into that catchment that can be released through the floodgates. We've got some problems. So there was some concern there for a while that we would lose control of the situation. But at the moment, they are looking at things like raising the Ivanhoe Dam even more to give that more capacity. You've also seen recently, which was a political decision, let's face it, they've actually released the dam down to about 75% of its capacity. The Ivanhoe Dam is a water storage dam and a flood mitigation dam. So when it's full, it can actually fill up another 170%, and that's for flood mitigation. The government's dropped that down another 25% to give some more leeway there. But if we did have another event like January, even if you dropped it down to 50%, with the amount of water that goes into the catchment, you're not going to have any impact on that.
This was about communication with private companies such as roading contractors. Brisbane City Council has a structure where they have a major projects office that really runs all their big infrastructure projects. So that office actually stepped in and coordinated the response from the private companies, the various contractors, and that worked superbly. Does that answer your question?
I think one of the lessons they did learn was that perhaps you do need some almost like emergency procurement practices in place. So if something like this happens, instead of scrambling around, you know that there's engineering companies like GHD or contractors that are willing to step up. You almost have them pre-qualified to step in. I think that's something they're looking at as well. The other thing, I suppose, is in terms of the contractors, one of the Brisbane City Council's waste contractors, and Robyn alluded this to before, their business continuity plans weren't quite up to scratch. So there's a lesson there between Brisbane City making sure that their service providers and contractors have their business continuity in places where plans that they can step in as well. But really, it was probably, to be frank, more good luck than good management in terms of you had the right people in the right place that really worked together effectively with industry and pulled something off in a remarkable time frame. There were thousands of contractors from, Abbey groups and those sorts of guys to little guys with, gurney hoses that were coordinated. It was quite an amazing effort.
Actually, just further, one of the things that really stood out there were the relationships that really underpinned that goodwill and the response from the business community.
Yeah. Look, that's again one of, I suppose, adversity brings people together. The Australian Broadcasting Commission, the ABC, that's the national, they virtually became the emergency services broadcaster. They suspended all programming and were just putting that conduit out. So people became very well aware that if you turned on the ABC, the local radio, you'd get the truth. The TVs and the print media were fantastic as well. Robyn mentioned that there was no flood maps available. The Courier Mail, the local rag, managed to publish a whole heap of flood maps at very short notice at their own expense, so people got the information as well. So the ABC was critical as the local radio station, but some of the things they're looking at in the digital age at the moment is it appropriate to have almost like a emergency radio station ready to launch on a digital frequency if something happens? That's something looking at as well. But also the police were very good, the army was very good. If they heard something silly on the radio, or if there was a stupid Facebook message went on, there was a very quick effort to dispel that very quickly. And there was some evidence of that, but we didn't have huge dramas or a misdeployment of resources. On the positive thing, there was some really effective deployment of resources. So you used to get a Twitter message out saying we need 60 strong blokes to shift something from here quickly. And within 10 minutes, you would get 100 strong blokes turning up to shift that sort of stuff. So in terms of the response time, it was brilliant.
Well, thank you. We are out of time. Perfect.
Thanks very much, and look forward to having a chat this afternoon over dinner, and I'm happy to answer any other questions you have. Cheers.
Likewise.